Hoi miteinander. I explain in this video in what capacity voter suppression and gerrymandering play a role in elections in Switzerland, and I will compare it to the situation in the USA. First, a basic overview of both countries' history regarding voting rights. Voting rights were from 1848 on, the inception of the Swiss Confederation, in a constant transition in the cantons. There were several inhibitions concerning wealth, property, religion, etc. before the Swiss state was formed. Many were dropped before the formation or shortly afterwards. The voting right in federal matters was depending on the cantons, and the federal constitution had a very limited scope. Eligible to vote is every Swiss who has reached the age of 20 and is not barred from active citizenship by law of the canton where he lives. The voting right, depending on certain conditions, slowly degraded, for example by the introduction of voting rights for Jews and illiterates. The exclusion for not paying taxes was abolished as well. But the women's suffrage was established not until 1971. Attempts beforehand were fruitless because the propaganda against it and the traditional image anchored firmly in their heads let the men vote against it. Of course, this is quite the shame compared to the US, which introduced it in 1920. This huge milestone, as well as not excluding convicted or insolvent citizens, means from this point on there is a general suffrage for Swiss adults. Across the federal constitution and all the cantonal constitutions there is following voting rights since 1976. All Swiss citizens over the age of 18, unless they lack legal capacity due to mental illness or mental incapacity, have political rights in federal matters. All citizens have the same political rights and duties. They may participate in elections to the National Council and in federal popular votes, and launch or sign popular initiatives and request for referendums in federal matters. So unless you have a legal guardian, you can vote as a Swiss citizen over 18. Of course, for the cantonal votes you have to have your residence there. In some cantons, foreigners with a residence permit are able to vote as well, but the conditions differ. In Fribourg, for example, besides the permit they have to live in the canton for at least 5 years. That's a progressive voting right to achieve a more inclusive and representative poll result. In conclusion, the voting rights are pretty clear and simple for Swiss adults since 1976. Now to the USA. The Constitution of 1787 did not specify any requirements for voting, because the states have the power to define them. In most states this led to voting rights for white male property owners, so very limiting. By 1856, most states did not have any restrictions regarding property or paying taxes, so for most white adult men voting became a right. The 14th Amendment expanded citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdictions thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This made the 15th Amendment possible. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Several other restrictions fell as well. I wasn't aware of the 15th Amendment, which already makes it very clear that no voter suppression is allowed. It baffles me that there are still attempts to infringe this amendment by disingenuous tactics. The Second Amendment is of course sacred, but not the 15th. How bizarre. Or just racist. To enforce the voting rights of people of color, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was established. No voting qualifications or prerequisite to voting or standard practice or procedures shall be imposed or applied by any state or political subdivision to deny or abridge the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. The initial 10 pages grew to 26 with the amendments. I skimmed through the first version and I focus on section 2, 4 and 5. The other sections are about the form of review, details concerning possible ways to undermine voting rights, or the punishment for violation. In section 4.A, the denial of the right to vote by failing a test or device is not allowed. So any voting inhibiting methods targeting people of color violate this act. In section 4c, examples for such methods are described, like a minimum degree or an attestation of qualification by a registered voter. Section 4b is essentially about the percentage of persons who registered for vote or who voted in the presidential election. If this is under 50%, Section 5 comes into effect. To administer any potentially voting inhibiting method, they have to be reviewed by the Attorney General or the District Court for the District Columbia. This made it difficult to set additional prerequisites, procedures, etc. to manipulate the possibility to vote. In 2013, in the case Shelby County v. Holder, Section 4b was ruled unconstitutional. Hence Section 5 is not enforceable, so the Attorney General or the District Court for the District Columbia are not able to review changes or introductions of procedures. To give the Attorney General the power back, Section 4b would have to be revised. The state legislatures were from that point on free to introduce voting inhibiting procedures, which some did swiftly. As an example, in North Carolina a voter identification law passed, which sets photo IDs as a requirement, but only very specific ones were eligible. The DOJ sued North Carolina and the court's verdict was that the requirements target African Americans with almost surgical precision. In the newest iteration, an ID is required beginning from 2020, but now many IDs are valid and a free one can be requested. The opening hours seem to be generous enough to not be a farce. If you never heard about this, I linked 2 videos I found informative. In Switzerland there is no registration for voting because there is an automatic entry in the electoral register of the municipality. The voting documents are sent by mail weeks beforehand. The voting laws are about the general procedure. An example for changes in the procedure is the option to vote per mail, which was introduced beginning from the 90s in all cantons. In my village, the poll site is open on polling day for 2 hours from 10 to 12 a.m., probably because it is really small. I went once, and I don't think I will do it again. Voting per mail is just way more convenient. I know there are potential problems, but polling sites aren't without any as well, so I would say they are acceptable. Unlike electronic voting, which is just dangerous and many people take it lightly. But I digress. Anyway, to infringe the voting right, the cantonal legislatures would face the obligatory referendum because any changes to the cantonal constitution demands a popular vote. Felony disenfranchisement is also a mean to manipulate the vote. At first I thought it would make sense since there are persons convicted for homicide and other violent acts. But then it occurred that this means non-violent acts as well. And due to the higher conviction rates of persons of color, the voting result is affected disproportionately. If one is charged with several DUIs, the person has to serve their sentence, of course. With a blood alcohol concentration above the threshold, that might mean being charged with a felony and hence a jail sentence. For this obviously stupid decision, being charged makes sense, but to strip off their voting rights? I don't see the connection. In Switzerland that is not a problem anymore since 1971, but in the US, limiting laws exist. Only 2 states have the same rights as Switzerland, and the rest has varying restrictions. A second method to manipulate votes is known as gerrymandering, the changing of electoral districts to gain advantages in an upcoming election. With data about the voting habits and other factors, the party with a majority in the government can redistrict to their advantage in these states. This redistricting occurs every 10 years in all states. There are many videos out there, so I will not explain the details. A factor for redistricting is segregation, and one thing I noticed after a quick glance over segregation data, was the higher segregation in most parts of the US compared to Switzerland. There is still quite the segregation present in the US to an extent I, as a non-US American, wasn't aware of. I have to point out though that the segregation is based on race in the US and on nationalities in Switzerland. Also there is an emphasis on white as the reference, so the segregation is always in relation to white people. In Switzerland it is about the segregation compared to the rest of the population, quasi a distribution of nationalities across the cantons. So even when people of color live in mixed areas, as long as white people are in suburbs or gated communities, it will count as a high segregation number. That's one reason why the count is higher compared to Switzerland, but I'm not convinced that this is enough for an explanation. Rather, there is still quite a high level of segregation in the US. Whether willingly or forced is another question. Surprisingly enough, in all three cases the segregation increased from 2000 to 2009. On the one hand, in this case, redistricting isn't just negative, because there is the possibility of having a minority grouped together to have a more appropriate representation within the boundaries of the first-past-the-post voting system. On the other hand, packing them together is controversial, since they have just one representative, which probably will be elected by a very high percentage. Also, due to population changes, the districts have to be resized to have a roughly equal amount of people in each one. Ultimately, it is the majority vote of a district and not a representation of all votes within one. As an example of the problem, I chose two districts of the Texas House of Representatives elections of 2018, where the results were close. For each district, there is one representative. So in these districts, the representative stands for only 52% of the voters. As you can see, in one case a Democrat stands for the majority and in the other a Republican. In Switzerland, FPTP voting was used at the inception with the same problems the US face nowadays. Gerrymandering, disproportionate representation of parties, abrupt swings of power exchange, which all led to tension between the big parties and animosity of the small parties towards the big ones. Philosopher and economist Victor Considerant proposed a proportional representation in Genève. Instead of voting one party in a district, the votes of all parties are considered. There are more than one seat per district, so the seats are assigned proportionally to the parties. 1918, a federal initiative for the introduction of a proportional voting system was successful, and a major party lost its parliament majority and more parties were able to participate in the legislative process. Some cantons determined a quorum, a minimum percentage to limit the splitting in too many parties. Since the cantons can have different versions of the voting system, the federal constitution's obligation to have a fair weighting of votes is at times threatened. In the canton Schwyz, a pure FPTP voting was pushed by a strong party, of course to secure a big portion of the cantonal parliament, but the voters chose the counter-proposal which stated a revised proportional voting. The slogan of the FPTP campaign was, "For a simple and comprehensible voting system," which is true, but cunning because they would prevent losing seats to smaller parties. Due to the proportional system, redistricting became pretty much useless, and in many cantons there is now regular redistricting. In most cantons they are even inscribed in their constitutions. The seats per district change due to the population fluctuations, but rarely the districts themselves. If a district has only one seat because the population changed drastically, redistricting is necessary to guarantee a proportional voting, or a different apportionment method has to be used. As an example for legislature election, I chose the Grossratswahl of the canton Basel-Stadt in 2016 in the district Rieche. One key difference is the seats. Instead of one, there are 11. Another one is the amount of parties as well as the distribution of seats. For Rieche, 1.2% of votes did not lead to a representation in the cantonal parliament. In general, huge percentages without representation are not possible with this system. Just a bit about the executives. The cantonal executives consist of 5 to 7 persons, are elected by the whole canton and are determined by FPTP. The difference to the US states is that the executive has a representative president, but in most cantons under the notion of primus inter pares, first among equals, so no additional power is granted. Also, the title rotates between members every year. In the US, the head of government of each state is the governor, with extensive power. The other members are elected by the people as well. A clear hierarchy exists and is maintained for the entire period. I just want to say a couple of sentences to a topic which could be in the entire video, namely apportionment methods. Because I somehow underestimated mathematicians to provide so many ways to achieve fair apportionment. I should know better. Because in each canton various apportionment methods are used with different flaws and strengths, I cannot present all of them. On a national level, the 200 seats of the Nationalrat, the equivalent of the House of Representatives, are first apportioned to the cantons. This is necessary because each canton represents one district, so again there are several seats per district and not only one. Afterwards the seats have to be apportioned according to the parties with another method. And finally the candidates with the most votes per party receive a seat. The first method is the Hamilton or Hare-Niemeyer method, and the second is the Hagenbach-Bischoff method, which is an extended version of the Jefferson method. In the US, it is again an election with one representative per district, and the seats per state are proportional to the population. The states then are redistricting to form the congressional districts, and then the mode is one seat per district again. For the calculation, the Hill-Huntington method is used. I named various methods without explaining them because they need exhaustive explanations, and 20 minutes of mathematical procedures for the fairest apportionment was something I decided against. I expounded in what capacity voter suppression and gerrymandering are issues in Switzerland's election compared to the USA, and now I let this matter rest. If you desire to comment, I just request you to be polite. I wish you a magnificent day.